Thank you. So I generally begin talks by giving additional background for the sorts of things I've been involved in, so to better understand where I'm coming from. So over the last 10 years, I've set up free schools in abandoned buildings, helped build a variety of digital tools, I've co-run community-based project spaces, I've participated in a large range of globally connected networks, I've conducted network analysis for a mix of big organizations, and in the present moment, as previously stated, I run the digital development of the Serpentine Galleries in London, whilst also facilitating the co-creation of a monastery. In this talk, I'd like to carve out a trajectory for the impact that new tools and spaces and platforms are having on the way we construct the world, to shine a spotlight on specific examples and to question, in contrast, why long-standing institutions, and perhaps specifically the art world, is struggling to keep pace with the implication of such change. In the abstract for this talk, I suggested that modern information technologies have transformed the lives of everyone, everywhere, throughout the past decade, but that we run the risk of forgetting some fundamentals. By giving the example of a UN study which highlighted that more people now have access to mobile phones than working sanitation, which is a strange, completely unjust and unprecedented situation to find ourselves in. In contrast to this, our world, defined by Western democracy, is starting to wake up to the impact of what many refer to as a digital revolution, which affects the everyday actions of each of us. At some point during this narrative, the forerunners, architects, and early adopters of this digital revolution began to illustrate a dissatisfaction with its effect, and increasingly are beginning to encounter its limits. As a result of such limits, this group have started building things that may fundamentally change the way in which we organize society at large. Again, I'm going to touch on quite a lot quite quickly, and in order to present a bigger picture of what's at stake, an attempt to rationalize the emergence of something different. And because many of these things and developments would require their own talk to explain in full, I'll share my slides with links to specific subject areas after the talk. So, I wanted to start with peer-to-peer because I think its shift in meaning is emblematic of how new forms of systems thinking is migrating from computer-based networks to human-based networks. Peer-to-peer, at its inception, described the change in protocol from a one-to-many model that consists of individual servers broadcasting information to be consumed by individual computers to a more resilient network formation in which many individual computers both consume, broadcast, and produce information within a network of other individual computers. And this is illustrated by this slide. So the first, on the left-hand side, is centralized, meaning if the server goes down, the information is lost. On the right-hand side, the second is decentralized, meaning if a computer goes down, another will probably have the information stored, and so it will remain available. This technical innovation gave rise to a set of things that existing institutions, such as governments, corporations, and other well-established trade organizations didn't really like. First of all, there was Napster, a free peer-to-peer file-sharing platform for music, which was shut down for copyright infringement in 2001 by the music industries. This was quickly replaced with the popularization of the BitTorrent protocol. Unlike Napster, the software that's used for accessing torrents is entirely interchangeable, meaning it's very difficult to remove a file if a critical mass of people want it to stay available, whether it be a Beyoncé song or a WikiLeaks file containing Bank of America's internal communications. The infrastructure as a whole is much more resilient. But this extreme decentralization necessitated the need for a shared directory of files, which led to the development of the Pirate Bay, a platform that flaunts itself as the solution to Hollywood's ailing distribution model. Despite being blocked in 15 countries, the Pirate Bay can be easily accessed anywhere globally. I think it's exceptionally important to acknowledge the impact of these technological innovations and what they naturalize in the generation coming of age now. Previously, we used peer-to-peer exclusively to describe platforms such as these, but recently the shared definition of what we mean when we say peer-to-peer has begun to change. Now peer-to-peer more commonly describes a process in which socially motivated communities, sometimes aided with digital tools, share resources, ideas, and come together to build things. Obvious examples of this are things like crowdfunding platforms such as Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and WeFund, which allow individuals to bypass existing funding models, avoid startup costs and manufacturing costs. Other examples of mainstream peer-to-peer social platforms would be things like Airbnb and couchsurfing. Less obvious is stuff like liquid democracy, a delegative voting model commonly facilitated by software such as liquid feedback and adhocracy, currently used by the Pirate Party. A shorthand explanation of this would be a voter can delegate her vote to a chosen expert. The vote can then be further delegated to the expert's chosen expert, thus building a network of trust. All delegations can be made, altered, revoked, and at any time on any specific topic, meaning a single individual could carry the thoughts and feelings of millions. If this seems complicated, it might be easier to imagine a plugin for Twitter or Facebook that allows you to delegate your own parliamentary vote to someone you follow with a click of a button. But why is this a good thing? Essentially, it enables specific areas of policy to be shaped by experts on the subject and is more representative of a greater number of people in the decisions that are ultimately made. If we can change our decision-making process, and more fundamentally what we currently mean when we say democracy, then why not also the way in which we make our laws and create legal entities? Liquid law is a concept that is in an even earlier stage of development than liquid democracy, by edge rider David Boville. It proposes the codification of law in such a way that legal entities and contractual arrangements could essentially be made programmable and buildable by anyone. An example of what this looks like at a very basic level would be something like one-click orgs that allows you to create single organizations with the click of a button by filling in a simple online form. But perhaps this doesn't sound feasible. 3 years ago, the suggestion that we might reimagine and rebuild our current processes for decision-making and all else with code may have sounded like a pipe dream or the words of a crazy person, but we don't actually live in that world anymore, partly because Bitcoin exists and everybody knows it. Bitcoin, in case you're still to experience the absolute horror of it, is a peer-to-peer cryptocurrency that runs in a similar way to things like BitTorrent and Napster, and is characterized by these qualities. It's decentralized, meaning that it can have no central bank. Instead, it is supported entirely by the network it's using it. It is borderless, untaxable, and currently there are no means of control. It's also relatively anonymous and easily scalable. For a brief period last week, Bitcoin was worth more than gold. These new platforms and tools might still be considered to sit firmly within the digital, despite the very real impact they have on our everyday lives. But these developments should be considered within the context of other existing financial instruments and algorithms, which may not be considered to be part of material reality, but become very real when we witness the foreclosure of homes or the loss of jobs to emerging markets. The internet, but primarily hackers and makers, are also applying these ways of thinking and building to what everyone can comfortably agree is real, concrete, material reality. And it might be suggested that this is a reaction to the loss of a dream, of a cyberspace as an entirely immaterial autonomous zone that was quashed with the realization that the internet is still tied to physical space through data centers, transatlantic cables, and therefore jurisdictional rules of sovereign nations. These limits seem to have provoked a fundamental rethink about the potential application of new protocols, technologies, and ways of thinking. Increasingly, the architects of these new technologies are extending their skills beyond the top-layer infrastructure of service and tools to the creation of physical space, transportation, agriculture, and space travel. One clear example of how this way of working is spreading to other things is through the use of certain design principles that were embedded further back than one might think, in the form of design patterns. A design pattern is a formal way of documenting a solution to a problem that is frequently encountered. The idea was introduced by the architect Christopher Alexander in a book called A Pattern Language. The elements of this language are entities called patterns. Each pattern describes a problem that occurs over and over again in our built environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that this solution can be applied 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. The usefulness of speaking of patterns is to have a common terminology for discussing situations we collectively encounter when we're trying to build stuff or get things done. A pattern must explain why a particular situation causes a problem and why the proposed solution is considered a good one. This approach to design, using patterns, was adopted early on in the field of computer science and can now be seen as a fundamental building block to understanding elements of programming languages. But it wasn't until recently that this approach was reappropriated back into its intended field, architecture. With a desire to create physical hubs and meetup spaces, hackers and makers created hacker spaces. These kinds of spaces are cooperatively run and owned, entirely decentralized, and one of the fastest growing types of spaces to emerge in the world. And this is because they make knowledge available on how to create your own hackerspace from the ground up, using design patterns documented and shared online. So, at the beginning of this talk, I drew attention to a statistic that more people now have access to mobile phones than working sanitation. It's not unfair, despite being touted as such, to say that technological innovation to date has yet to do a great job of leveling the playing field when it comes to basic human needs. However, at the better end of movements such as open source hardware are things like open source ecology and the hex year. Each project proposes to significantly lower the bar to entry for housing and feeding oneself below the poverty line. The hex year is a free housing solution for the world, designed to be built from globally available materials, is zero waste, and buildable by anyone, whereas open source ecology presents a freely available toolkit for rebuilding civilization. The last thing I'm going to mention is the monastery, which is a project that seeks to participate in and foster the types of ideas and ethos that I have so far outlined, which I have personally been working on for the past year with a community called Edge Riders, which Nadia will speak at greater length about later today. The monastery takes the best parts of the hackerspace model and asks, what would it look like if we filtered it through a reimagining of what monastic principles could mean in the contemporary moment? The primary difference between monastery and hackerspaces is that its work is tied to the needs and challenges of its local geography. The intention is to create a network of spaces that large community can travel between, not dissimilar to the pilgrimages of monks in the Middle Ages. At a very base level, it can be described as a residency program for expert problem solvers. This approach to establishing a space collapses pattern languages, decentralized infrastructure, liquid law, and transparent decision-making processes, among other things, into a geographically based model that is focused on tackling 4 core problems that we're probably all familiar with. Large numbers of empty and disused housing stock throughout the world, austerity in Europe and the rollback of state services, high unemployment, particularly among young and highly skilled individuals, and brain drain from small towns and cities. The first monastery is set to open in 2 months' time in Matera, in southern Italy. If you're interested in getting involved, the final call for applications has just been announced and is open for the next 2 weeks. I purposely didn't base this entire talk around my own project because I felt it would be more productive to highlight its role in a broader set of things. But I wanted to pause for a moment and draw things back. We're here today talking ostensibly in an exclusive arts or cultural context as if silos of knowledge still persist. I'm not suggesting by presenting these things that art itself should begin to now serve a specific purpose, but I might be suggesting that artistic discourse needs to step its game up, if it is to contribute in a meaningful way to the way a global conversation is being had about the shape of the world and the way that we want to exist in the next 30 or 40 years, or 1,000 years, or millenniums. I certainly don't believe that the hackers should be solely responsible for building the future, and this means that there are roles to play. Simultaneous to my work in these areas, I've worked with institutions to try and orientate them to this change, with no ambition to allow recuperation, because frankly, I don't think it's a particularly easy thing to do in the present moment. In the interest of actually being useful today, and not just sharing examples of interesting and innovative new models we could learn from, I'd like to talk a bit about the limits of our institutions and why they are struggling to adopt new ways of existing in the world, and consider what they need help with, what they're likely to fall down on, and what compromise might look like with a network whose power is rapidly overtaking yours. So firstly, what are the broader issues? Institutions are extremely risk-averse, which is fair enough when you're trying to stay alive and archive knowledge over time. They're slow to change, struggle to adapt, and as a result are intensely inefficient. Culturally, they tend to strive for perfection, don't understand iterative process, and try to conceal failure, instead of recognizing it as an effective mechanism for improvement. In the monastery, we will document our mistakes publicly and not our successes. Hierarchy. It speaks for itself. The organizational structure of most institutions in the present moment is top-down, and they're finding it difficult to do things as a result. You'll struggle to mobilize a critical mass in the same way networks do if individuals doing the work aren't allowed to have the final say on its outcomes. These features can be said to characterize our experience of many institutions, governments, corporations, galleries, or museums, etc. But simply by declaring that you want to go digital in the terms that I've set out doesn't mean that the capacity or ability is there. Institutions simply can't, at least in the present moment, do many of the things that networks can. Let's be more specific, though. Whilst we're still working within the spheres of specialized knowledge, let's talk about where art struggles to embrace these positive and constructive developments at the scale of a 1,000-year institution and mainstream adaptation. Notions of genius. Individual, institutional, and artistic ego don't meet well these new ways of working. It's better to acknowledge your contribution to its success than it is to claim it as your own. This work that I've been describing and the kinds of projects that I've outlined may be fast to learn, but is a lacking skill set in the arts, whether it be programming, open source development, or new forms of organizing. Because the art world at the current moment has very little to put on the table, individuals with these skill sets are unlikely to work for free, and on a contractual basis, the day rate will rapidly outstrip the budgets of institutions. Originality. The art world has a tendency to claim originality under individual authorship rather than acknowledge its creation as a component part of a larger whole. So, the examples I presented today are not going to be institutionalized with the shell of existing institutions. The relationship between the edges, counterculture, and what remains of the mainstream is going to have to change. When you consider there is an expanding third culture growing from the edges of society, be it hacker or other, which is capable of lowering the transactional cost of organizing, focuses exclusively on work that produces its own meaning, is capable of establishing its own physical spaces, and is rapidly creating its own currency, legal infrastructure, and modes of governance, you either have to accept the rules of the game have changed, or you and your institution will likely perish. If there's one golden rule to live by in the current moment, it is participate, don't dominate. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this very interesting talk. I'd like now to welcome Raphael Dörek. Raphael